Hi everyone and welcome to today's lecture. We will be focusing on three different forms of ecology. We will look at population ecology, community ecology, and global ecology, including looking at ecosystems. Now you'll notice in today's lecture, we'll basically be touching upon a lot of terminology that we've covered before. So please make sure that you're always reviewing your previous material, especially keywords, definitions, terminology helps you not only understand the course better, but it helps you understand any question that I can ask of you later on. Now, one of those terms that we've defined before, and I just want to remind you of what it means, is the term population. And as you can see in this figure here, population is part of that hierarchy of organization of, living things, non-living things that we look at. So first you have an individual organism, and then a population is defined as a group of individuals of the same species, okay? And they are living in the same place at the same time. So please, circle, star, highlight that definition of what is a population. It's when you have a group of organisms or individuals of the same species. So population has to be the same species that's living in a particular area at a particular time. So then when you think of that definition and you ask yourself, well, then what is population ecology? Well, it means that we're going to be studying, how and why the number of individuals in a population can change over time. The various factors that can influence this population. Some of the things that we look at when we're studying a population include distribution and abundance. Okay, they're two fundamental concepts. And when we look at these terms, a lot of times you'll see a particular range for, certain species. And when we say range, we're talking about the geographic distribution of that, population. Okay, meaning where will you find it geographically? So you notice on this figure, you can have a global range. So looking at across the planet, where will you find that population distributed? Or you can have a regional or local range, so smaller areas that you're looking at to see where exactly in that geographic region or that small locale do you have the population living. Okay, so the range of a population is simply its geographic distribution. Where will you find it geographically? Now, there are two factors that will determine this geographic distribution, this range, and that is the abiotic factors and the biotic factors. And we've mentioned these terms before. Abiotic means non-living factors, so things like temperature, rainfall, or whether there's, huge structures like a mountain or an ocean. And biotic factors are the living factors. So think about competitors or predators that may be in some geographic regions that might affect how populations organize themselves. Now keep in mind that these ranges, these geographic distributions, they're not constant. Okay, they are something that we call dynamic, meaning that they're always changing because biotic and abiotic factors change over time. Now, when we look at the range of populations, there's three different types of arrangements within that range that I want you to be aware of. There's random distribution, there's a uniform distribution, and a clumped distribution, okay? And what these are saying is that individual organisms can arrange themselves in different ways within a population. So that's what we mean by these three types of arrangements. It's how the individuals within that population will arrange themselves. And when you look at this figure, you can kind of figure out what the arrangement actually is. So this first one, random distribution, it means that the position of each of these individual organisms, represented by a dot here, is independent of each other. Okay? So kind of like, trees in a forest all scattered about. They're independent of each other. Clumped is down here. Clumped, however, now instead of being randomly scattered about, you notice that the individuals are clumping together in these little collections, and that's basically, dependent on what's available in that habitat, okay, the resources that are available. And then the middle one that you see here is a uniform distribution. And that you usually see, if there's some sort of negative interactions between different, individuals, such as, competition for the resources or whatnot. So they will be, in a uniform distribution where none of them are too close to each other kind of situation. Now, when you think of random or the highly organized or the clumped, gathering in particular locations based on resources, if you look at these three, which do you think humans have? Well, circle, star, highlight, clump distribution. Okay, circle, star, highlight, clump distribution is how human populations arrange themselves. And think about it. We clump together based on resources. We clump together into cities, into towns. Those cities and those towns are clumps of human populations. Okay, so please circle, star, highlight that humans have a clumped distribution. Now, when we study populations, there's a lot more than just where they're located that we like to study. Okay, when it comes to populations, we like to study the statistics of that population. So things like size, growth, density, their distribution, the rates of events like birth and death. And when you are studying all of these factors that, determine the size and structure of that population through time, that means you are studying its demography. Okay, so demography, that is the study of factors that determine the size and structure of a population. And so, for instance, the four processes that we really focus on in demography are seen right here in this figure. We look at birth and death rates, as well as immigration rates and emigration rates. Okay, and so these terms, what they mean, birth, giving life, the new lives, deaths, you're losing lives in that population. Immigration is when individuals enter the population, where emigration, you can underline that E in emigration and write exit. So underline the E of emigration and the E of exit, because emigration is when an individual moves out of a population, leaves that population. Okay? So the four processes that we really study to determine the number of individuals in that population are births, deaths, immigration, which again is moving into the population, and emigration, which is moving out, exiting. Now, what we can then do when we're looking at these kinds of statistics is we can create what's called life tables. And this lovely table here is a life table. And if you Google life tables, you'll see not all of them will look exactly the same. Each one may have slightly different columns or headings on them. But ultimately, what a life table is just a table of numbers that summarizes the probability that an individual in a population is going to survive and reproduce in any given time interval, so throughout its lifetime. Okay, so a life table is just what it sounds like. It's a table mapping out the life probability of an individual, the probability that it will survive and reproduce. And you're going to see some of the terms, commonly encountered in life tables on the next slide. So now looking at that same table that we had, we're going to go through some of the terms that you'll encounter on it. The first one is the age class. And what age class is basically a group of individuals of a specific age. So for instance, when you see this 4 here, that's the age class 4, meaning any of the female lizards on this chart, because this is for female lizards in the Netherlands, any of the female lizards that are between 4 to 5 years old. Okay, so 4 to 5, then once they hit 5, they're in age class 5. When they hit 6 years old, they're in age class 6. So age class is the group of individuals of a specific age. But now if you think about it, not all the individuals, unfortunately, in a population will make it to certain age classes. Not every female lizard is going to survive to be 4 years old because there's a lot of things that can go wrong or that they can encounter. So the next column that you see here is the number of survivors. So it shows how many of those females actually make it to that particular age class. How many survive to reach that point? Now, when you are looking at a life table, a lot of times you are following a particular cohort. And you hear this term in academics in your college career also. So for instance, all of you who come into a school and let's say are going to be graduating in 2024, for instance, you are the 2024 cohort. Okay, that's expected that you can be followed, that whole class of students, once they enter, can be followed throughout their academic career. And so the cohort on the life table is the same thing. It's a group of the same age individuals that you can follow throughout time. So for instance, in this chart, the cohort was 1,000 female lizards. Okay, so 1,000 female lizards are the cohort, and as you can see, when we follow that cohort throughout time, not all of them are going to make it. Not all of them will survive. Okay, then you have a term that you may not be as familiar with, which is fecundity. Okay, so fecundity, and what fecundity means is the number of females produced by each female population that can have offspring. Okay, so it's basically looked at, fecundity is the reproductive output of that population. How many females are produced that can then have offspring of their own. Okay, and ultimately you're able to then calculate a reproductive rate, which will indicate, is that population increasing over time or is it decreasing and getting smaller over time? Now, I keep mentioning survivorship and surviving. When it comes to survivorship, there are 3 types, and I want you to know them by name, by type 1, type 2, and type 3. Now, the first one, type 1, is the type that humans have. Basically, you'll notice that there's a very high chance of survival going throughout most of the time that a human, would be aging. But then what do you notice? In old age, suddenly the survivorship, people surviving, drops dramatically. So in an organism like humans, you have a good chance of surviving throughout, your young years. And then once you hit old age, boom, the chance of survivorship plummets. And that's something that we've really seen in terms of the COVID pandemic. You've really gotten a sense of how age can really make a dramatic difference in survivorship. Now, there's also type 2 survivorship. And what you notice is in type 2 survivorship, all throughout the aging of this organism, there's basically the same probability of dying in each year. Then in type 3, what do you notice? Instead of old age being the very risky time in that organism's life, for type 3, it's very young age in which there's a very low survivorship. And then once the organism makes it past that very dangerous early years, they then have a high survivorship. You notice that the angle of this curve is no longer a sharp decline. It's kind of evening out. So in these type 3 organisms, picture it like a lot of insects and plants. So basically with a lot of insects and plants, if they're in their early stages, meaning if an insect is in its larval stage, if a plant is in its little tiny seedling stage, they're very at risk in terms of dying. There's an extremely high death rate in their early years, but once they make it through, so if it makes it through that larval phase, if it makes it through that seedling phase, then it's a very good chance of it surviving a nice long life. Okay, so please make sure you're clear in terms of type 1 versus type 2, type 3, and the fact that humans are type 1. We have high survivorship early on in our lives, and then it plummets to low survivorship once we hit old age. Now, when we talk about, survivorship and the risks involved in making it through life, ultimately in populations, the survival rates and the overall size can be affected by a lot of different factors. And usually, you can't have this limitless population, this huge population. At some point, there has to be something controlling that population size and limiting it. Now, there are 2 categories we put these factors into. We have density-independent factors limiting populations, and we also have density-dependent factors. Now, density-independent factors, I want you to write that these are things that will alter birth rates and death rates irrespective of the number of individuals in the population, okay? What that means is density-independent factors will change the amounts of births, the amounts of deaths in a population, but in a way that's not dependent on how many individuals are currently in that population, how big it is. It's not size dependent. Okay, examples of that would be, for instance, if there was a sudden natural disaster and now a whole bunch of that population just got wiped out and killed. For instance, like if a volcano erupted and just killed a whole bunch of members of that population, well, that population just shrank, but not based on, being too big, for instance. It was just this sudden events that the organisms had no control over, the population had no control over. And what you'll notice is density-independent factors usually have to do with the abiotic environment, okay, meaning non-living factors. Okay, make sure you write density-independent factors tend to have to do with abiotic or non-living factors or variables, such as sudden weather changes, okay, or natural disasters. Whereas density-dependent factors that will limit how big a population is, those are usually biotic, meaning living, okay? And you can see that in the figure here. For instance, parasites or predators or competition from other living organisms can limit how big that population can get. Okay, so for instance, if you have predation, you will have, if there's more predators, that population size will end up smaller. It keeps it smaller. If a predator suddenly goes away, boom, that population size gets bigger. Okay? And so that's a biotic factor, a living factor in predators. We're going to go over this a little bit more in the upcoming slides to make it a little clearer later on in our slides as well. So we keep talking about populations and how large they get or how they're limited, and I want to take a minute to just point out the human population. And as you can see, especially in this timeline graph here, the human population has been skyrocketing over the past few years. And when we look at human populations, it varies each place that you look at. And the trends in those human populations vary depending on, resources and, for instance, things like environmental factors, or whether it's a developing country, a third world country, a highly developed country. All of this can affect human population. Now, when we look at human population growth, one of the things you'll see done in studies is what we call age structure or age structure trends. And like I was just saying, that basically varies each location. And the figures here show two age structure trends in which they basically graph out all of the possible age groups from birth until, 100 and plus. And they map out, based on census data or data that they have from a previous year, how many males and females are in each age group, how many survived, and then they make projections about future years, which is that beige, almost transparent kind of background that you see. That's a prediction versus the red and blue being the actual values during the 2010 data. Now, what you will notice is, like I was saying before, there are differences between developed countries. Notice how you have a lot more individuals making it up to the 90, even 95 or 100 range, whereas in developing countries, they have a lot more individuals that are in young age groups, but not as many will make it to the highest groups. And the more developed that a country becomes, so for instance, you see projections showing, the more developed it becomes, the more individuals in an age structure you'll have at the top of that age structure. Okay, you'll have longer bars at the top of the age structure, demonstrating more individuals make it to older age. Now, I want you to remember this point here. How large exactly is the current human population worldwide? And we are almost at 8 billion. So the last they demonstrated was around 7.86 or 7.861 billion, but you can think of it as quickly approaching the 8 billion mark. Okay, now that's rising quickly, but ultimately it will all depend on fertility rates and things going on in our communities. Some people may ask themselves, well, what does it matter knowing all of this about populations and ecology? What can it do for us? Sometimes students, they see the value in anatomy and physiology because of medical benefits, but they don't necessarily see the value in studying things like the environment and ecology. But population ecology is very, very valuable to us, and it helps conserve biodiversity, meaning it helps protect us from having a whole bunch of different species. Okay, biodiversity means you have a lot of variety in the types of living organisms around, and that's very valuable. Now, how exactly can population ecology do that? The main way is that the data that we gain from studying populations and from studying specifically population ecology is that we can then design ways to protect species from, completely becoming extinct or from even reaching the endangered stage. And pandas are a great example. See that little guy there? If you like pandas, well, you can thank China for us still having them, because they used population ecology and recognizing the severe danger that pandas were in, how close they were becoming to becoming extinct, and they took the initiative to really dedicate time and resources to helping pandas reproduce, helping to restore their numbers, protecting them from the dangers of the world. And they have basically gotten pandas off of the critically endangered list because they have spent so much time and efforts through population ecology and conservation bio to protect these beautiful organisms. And there's a lot more animals that are still at risk of becoming extinct. And so population ecology and conservation biology help us to recognize what factors, whether they're abiotic or biotic, are really limiting that population. And so once you understand the factors limiting the population, you're able to target them and help correct the problem. In addition to studying populations and populations ecology, community studies are also very important. And just as a reminder, what we mean by community is, whereas a population is a single species, a community is all of the different species, okay, all the different populations that are interacting in a particular area. And so, for instance, in this figure here, you see the species that is this tree, the caterpillar, the bird, and even the little tiny microbes interacting with each other. And when you look at them all together, that's a community. If you were just studying the caterpillars in this area, it would be a population, whereas studying all of them interacting, the tree, the caterpillar, the bird, the microbes, you are now studying a community. And so community ecology is just what it sounds like. It is studying these communities, studying the interactions between different species in an area, to learn about how that community works and how to manage them in order to, again, preserve the species, help the ecosystem, and ensure that that's an environment that organisms can thrive. So within this community, or within any community that you look at, there are a lot of different ways that the species there can interact, okay? Now, a lot of the terms that we're going to go over, you've heard about in this course in different points, so it shouldn't be completely new to you. But basically, picture a community, picture all of these different species living together, and think of what they can do in terms of interacting with each other. There are 4 main types of interactions I want you to be aware of. Make sure you know each of these terms and what it means. So there's commensalism, competition, consumption, and mutualism. And in parentheses, I basically put, you have 2 individuals. A plus sign means that one of the individuals is benefiting. A 0 means that an individual has no change. And a minus means that an individual is hurt by this interaction. So you'll notice that in commensalism, one individual is benefiting, whereas the other remains unaffected, okay, unchanged. Competition, on the other hand, is what we call it when both organisms have their fitness lowered because they are now using the same resources and have to fight for those resources. So it basically limits the amount of resources when more than one species needs it, and that lowers the fitness for both. So that's why you see minus, minus. Consumption is when one organism eats the other organism or absorbs nutrients from the other organism. So if one of them's getting eaten, I'm pretty sure that's going to be a negative for that one. whereas the other one is getting nutrients and getting nice food, so that's a benefit for that one. It increases its fitness. So for consumption, one has increased fitness, the other individual is decreased. Now for consumption, I want you to put specific examples of this as herbivory, meaning eating plants, so Herbivory, herbivory, predation, and parasitism. Okay, so please make note that herbivory, predation, and parasitism are all examples of consumption, where one organism is either eating or absorbing nutrients from another organism. The last one is mutualism, and both species will have increased fitness from this. So both species are basically helping each other out. I want to take a moment to go through a few of those species interactions we just mentioned in a little more detail. The first one I want to go through is competition. And competition can either be intra, okay, intra meaning within, intraspecific competition, or interspecific competition. And when you see inter, that means between. Okay, so intra is within a species, inter is between different species. Okay, so intraspecific, make sure you write down, is when you have individuals that are from the same species competing for some sort of resource. Now it can be space, it can be food, it can even be mating. So for instance, the example that I put here, you have males from the same species tend to fight to get the girl, okay? So that can be an example of intraspecific. The moment that you see more than one species competing, fighting for something, that is then interspecific competition. And that could be, fighting for the same kind of resources that you would have in intraspecific. Okay, so interspecific is fighting again for things like food, space, water, the female's attention. But the difference is that now it's with different organisms, different species. And so in this case, if for instance you have a lion fighting a hyena to try and get food, okay, they're both trying to take down the same antelope or the same zebra, well, they're now engaging in interspecific competition. In this scenario with two or more species fighting each other, competing with each other, that competition can further be narrowed down to either symmetric or asymmetric competition. Okay, and it's basically based on the overlapping area of competition. So you can see, for instance, in this region here, these two species overlap in their competition for that particular seed. And so competition between species can be called symmetric if both species end up with a similar decrease in fitness. Okay, if both species have a similar decrease in fitness during this competition, it is said to be symmetric. Whereas if only one of the species ends up suffering a greater decrease in fitness, whereas the other species is not hurt as much, that is called asymmetric competition. Both are examples of interspecific. It's just a matter of, do they both decline dramatically, or is only one hurt more than the other from the competition? When we talk about competition and, the idea of resources for these organisms, there's two terms I want you to know the difference between. There's the fundamental niche and the realized niche. Now, again, I've mentioned this in previous lectures. Sometimes you'll hear it as niche, either way, same term. It's basically the resources that that organism is going to be using, its role in that environment, the range of resources that it can use. Now, the difference between the two, I emphasize a single term for each to help you remember this difference. The fundamental niche is basically the theoretical, full possible resources that the species can basically use, okay? So it's the theoretical range of all possible resources that that species can use. Whereas the realized niche, that is the portion of that fundamental niche that a species is actually using, okay? And it's only a portion of that theoretical amount of resources because of things that are limiting it, such as competition with other organisms. So you notice in this figure here, this full orange curve represents the fundamental niche of species number 2. Okay, so this is all of the resources in that environment that species number 2 can use, that theoretically they have access to. But because there's competition there, thanks to species number 1, that competition knocks down the amount of resources that species number 2 ends up actually being able to use because it can't strongly enough compete with species number 1. So it loses a good chunk of that fundamental niche and only gets to use a much smaller amount. Okay, so the key word that I want you to circle, star, highlight for yourself is when you see theoretical, we're talking about the fundamental. Or when you hear the word possible, all possible resources, all theoretical resources that a species can use. Whereas when you see the word actual, that tells you we're talking about the realized niche. Okay? Make sure you're clear about the difference between the two. I can describe one and you should be able to identify it right away. So you're seeing a whole lot of competition here, right? Well, over time, the more and more competition that these species basically have to live through can actually cause some interesting changes in those species. And the changes that it ultimately leads to are twofold. They're connected changes. One is the niche differentiation, and the other is character displacement. Okay, so this figure here shows niche differentiation, and basically that shows that if the two species are competing generation over generation, an evolutionary change in resource needs or usage may actually occur, creating this looks like a resource partitioning, a separation. So you see that initially these two species were competing, they were going for the same resources, and then over generations, their resources used completely separated from each other so that they were no longer competing. Okay, so that's niche or niche differentiation. This figure here is to help you see character displacement. Okay, what character displacement is that over time, generations, you end up with evolutionary changes, not just in the resources used, but evolutionary change can also occur in species traits that basically then enables them to use those different resources and get rid of, this competition that's weakening their fitness. And the classic example here is the beak of certain finches. So when these finches were competing with each other over and over, then over generations, it was seen that you ended up with larger beak sizes from certain species when that, species was near a competitor. When it's a location that is not with a competitor, you see smaller beak size. So over time, generation can ultimately lead to evolutionary changes in species traits, what they look like to be able to use, certain resources. So that is character displacement. If the species traits such as beak size, claw size, any of that changes, that's character displacement, which allows them to use different resources. The evolutionary change of using different resources so they're no longer competing, that is the niche or niche differentiation. Okay, so make sure you're clear in terms of what those terms mean. The next species interaction I want to look at with you is consumption. And this is the one that we said is when one animal, one organism is either eating or absorbing nutrients from another species. Now, when you look at this, there are three types of consumption, and we've mentioned them before, but just a reminder. Herbivory is, the idea, think herbivores. This is when herbivores consume plants or algae. So they're they're feeding off of these living plants and algae. Predation is when a predator will kill and consume, so kill and ingest, all or most of another individual, and we call that individual that they are consuming the prey. And then and notice that this one is, a lot of times carnivores. And then the last one is my personal favorite, since we discuss a lot into this one in microbiology, and that last one is parasitism, when a parasite is feeding off of small amounts of nutrients or tissue from the host species. Okay, and that one usually takes a lot longer time in terms of consumption compared to herbivory or predation. There are actually two categories I want you to know for parasitism. There is endoparasites and there is ectoparasites. Okay, so endo meaning within. So that's kind of like if you have a tapeworm living inside of you. And ecto are parasites that will latch onto you from the outside. So for instance, ticks. If a tick latches onto you and starts to feed off of you. Okay, so be clear, make sure you write down for parasitism endo and ectoparasitism. Now, when you talk about consumption, you have to look at the idea of not only the one doing the consuming, you have to think about the one getting targeted and how they might defend themselves. And there are two categories in terms of defenses that I want you to know. And one of them you can remember based on what we talked about in genetics, in the genetics lectures way back at the beginning of the semester. When you heard constitutive in terms of genes, your constitutive or housekeeping genes were always on, right? They were always active. They were always there. That's what constitutive or standing defenses are. They are a part of the organism, and they are present even when consumers are not around. Okay, so these are things that may help that species basically hide or flee, basically protect themselves. And sometimes it'll be like a protective armor around them that's always there. Sometimes it will be that their outer tissues are always toxic or always have, this coloring and appearance that shows that they're always toxic. This right here, you see those thorns. So next time you see a rose, a beautiful rose with thorns on it, well, remind yourself that that's just the beautiful rose's way of having constitutive defenses that are always there, whether the threat is present or not. Whereas inducible defenses that's something that they will activate. So that's something that will be activated only when the predator is basically around. Okay, so if instead of always having tissues that are toxic, if instead the organism will suddenly secrete toxins or will spit out a toxic saliva, then in that case, we consider it an inducible defense. Okay, so make sure you're clear on those examples. Now, like I said, parasitism is my favorite. Okay, we talk about this a lot in microbiology, but I wanted to give you a really cool example to kind of spark your interest in terms of this material. So this example of parasitic consumption. Here we have a regular little ant. He's perfectly healthy, uninfected. There's a type of nematode, nematode being a parasitic little teeny tiny worm. There's a type of nematode that when it infects the ant, it changes or it manipulates their host appearance and behavior so that, what do you notice? Now suddenly this ant, its body looks like a nice juicy fruit. The little berry, a little berry that you would find on this plant where it ends up walking along. Now this is valuable to that parasite because the nematode, in order to complete their life cycle, they need to grow inside of birds. And if this little insect suddenly if its little body looks like a nice juicy berry, what's going to happen? It's more likely to get eaten by a bird, and then the nematode, that parasite, can finish out its life cycle because it needs to do that inside of birds. So it's interesting that, yes, parasites can manipulate their host. They can manipulate what they look like, the host. They can manipulate the behavior of the host. And why do they do that? The parasite does that to maximize their own fitness, to maximize their own chances of survival. And so this example of a nematode infecting an ant and making it look like a little berry increases the chances that that nematode will get eaten, that the ant will get eaten by a bird, and now the nematode inside of a bird can carry out their life cycle. So if this stuff really interests you, make sure to take microbiology because we talk about a lot of cool stuff in that class. Interestingly, understanding consumers in community ecology has helped us in terms of developing biocontrol agents because you can do what's called integrated pest management. Okay, integrated pest management, the way textbooks like to define that, is basically any strategy to maximize crop productivity while minimizing the use of insecticides or harmful chemicals. Okay, so the goal of integrated pest management is to maximize agriculture while reducing insecticides or harmful compounds. And so what they sometimes use is the idea of biocontrol agents, meaning using biological living creatures in order to reduce other pests. So for instance, the use of known predators or parasites to help target, potential pests. Now that's very beneficial because, it's the idea of reducing harmful compounds and maximizing crops. But what's the risk? Well, anytime you're introducing new species to communities in order to, trying to limit one species, you can have a lot of unexpected, domino effects, consequences on all of the other organisms. So basically, you have to be very careful. If you're trying to introduce a natural predator, for instance, to take down any kind of pests. So sometimes instead what we do is we kind of play around with genetic engineering to develop, a biological system to target the pests without messing up the ecosystem too much. But again, it takes a lot of practice, a lot of thought, because everything's connected in communities, in ecosystems. So you got to be careful with integrated pest management or biocontrol agents. As I mentioned, communities, ecosystems, they're very intricate. There's a whole lot going on. In this slide, I summarize the idea that there are 4 main attributes that will contribute to a community structure. The first one is the number of species. So for instance, looking at all of these different species, well, how many different species do you have in that community? The second attribute is the sum of the interactions of all of those species. And a lot of times you see, sum of interactions studied in things like a food web, kind of like you see here, okay? There's also relative abundance. So the first bullet point, we were saying the number of different species. Relative abundance looks at the amount of each of those species. That can greatly contribute to a community structure, because think of it. What if you have more abundance of a particular predator? Well, then you'll have less abundance of a particular prey. So relative abundance of each species is important, as well as physical attributes of that community and that environment. So the physical attributes, that's more like physical attributes of that ecosystem that then affects community structure. Because the physical attributes are not just biotic, not just living things, it can be abiotic also. So what I mean by this is, for instance, if there's more grass, so that's a biotic physical attribute of this, area that can then have a cascading effect on the community structure because they rely on grass as a producer. Abiotic, physical attributes that can influence community structure are things like rocks, mountains, how much water is there in that area. Okay, these kind of things can either get in the way of organisms, they can provide hiding places for prey. They can provide, resources of water, sustenance. So any of these 4 things are major attributes that really guide community structure. As you've seen, there are a lot of different things that can affect an ecological community. And so while these communities change over time, disturbances occur that end up promoting change. And I ask you, what is a disturbance? What's meant by a disturbance? Well, sometimes I think the answer is my undergrads. But what is meant by an ecological disturbance or disturbance regime? That's basically any strong, short-lived disruption to a community. And ultimately, these strong disruptions to the community change how the living or non-living resources are distributed within that community. Now, the impact of, these disturbances in that community is kind of measured based on 3 factors. One, what type of disturbance is it? The second factor is the frequency of that disturbance. How often is it happening? And number 3, which, is common sense, the severity. The severity of that disturbance can have a big impact on that ecological community. Now, when we look at all of this, sometimes there are really severe disturbances. So kind of, if you remember seeing on the news year after year, those horrible California fires, right? Those fires are severe ecological community disturbances, okay? And when you look at the severe disturbances, what they basically end up doing is they remove all or most of the organisms in that community. And the recovery that follows after, what that is called succession. Okay, so what happens after a severe disturbance is succession, and that's the recovery after that brutal disturbance has destroyed all or most of the organisms there. Now, there are two types of succession. The figure that I have on this page, please write that this is secondary succession, okay? The way that you can tell that is that in the first slide, you see grass, okay? So when you see grass in that first slide, that will tell you that that's secondary succession, because the difference between primary and secondary is that a primary succession happens when the severe disturbance has removed the soil and any of the organisms that would have been living in or above that soil surface. Okay, and so in that situation, basically the pioneers have to be, something like lichens or moss that can only grow on rocks rather than soil. So if this figure in the first picture had rocks only and you don't see any soil, any grass, that would be primary succession, okay? Because the disturbance destroyed or removed even the soil. Whereas secondary succession occurs when the disturbance removes some or all of the living creatures from that area, but it leaves the soil intact. So in secondary succession, the soil is left intact. That includes what's in the soil. So for instance, seeds, grasses, even the little microbes that live in soil, they're all okay in secondary succession. Okay, so again, if the soil has been removed in a disturbance, then you will have primary succession, and you'll see rocks first, and pioneer organisms that can survive on rocks rather than soil, whereas in secondary succession, you would end up having soil. Still, soil would remain. Everything else would get destroyed. The living organisms would be destroyed, but you would at least still have the soil to then rebuild. And what succession is that gradual rebuilding of that ecological community. And it takes time. It occurs in a lot of stages, but eventually you can have a thriving community again after that disturbance. You may have noticed in the previous slide I mentioned the term pioneer species, and we encounter pioneer species during succession, and these are the organisms that will be the first ones arising in a succession, after a severe disturbance has wiped out all of the other life. Now, pioneer species, they tend to be very weedy. Okay, and by weedy, we talk about a plant that's basically adapted for growing in disturbed soils. Okay, so a weed is a plant adapted for growth in disturbed soils. And you've probably seen this even in your own yard. You'll see, those little plants that can sprout up in the cracks of your sidewalk, for instance, or in your driveway, where there's not much soil, nutrient, space, but they can thrive, okay? And so a lot of pioneer species are actually weeds because they can survive in disturbed soil. Or in the case of primary succession, they can even survive without soil, but on things like rocks, okay? Now, when we talk about successions, species will have three possible effects on the subsequent species, because remember I said succession occurs in these gradual steps. And so when you have species in these gradual steps, they can have three possible effects on the later species in succession. The first possible effect is called facilitation. Okay, and that's basically when the earlier species will help make conditions more favorable to the growth of later species. So for instance, plants that will help the soil be more rich, have more nutrients, have more, nitrogen, oxygen flow to them. Okay, so facilitation are when the early species help the growth of later species. There's tolerance when the early species do not affect, the later species. They don't affect whether, the later species will be more likely to grow, less likely to grow. And then there's inhibition, and that's exactly what it sounds like. This is when certain species inhibit the growth of later species. Okay, so they're more like competitive type species. So these are problematic in succession. Okay, so 3 possible effects: facilitation, tolerance, or inhibition. It's basically saying that species during succession can either help other species form, they can basically do nothing toward the other species, not help, not hurt them, or they can inhibit the growth of other species. Okay, so 3 possible effects. Now, when you're looking at communities and studying communities, 2 terms you encounter, we've kind of mentioned before in previous slides, but we didn't really, emphasize them as much. So I do want to make sure that you have both of these terms written down and defined and understand the difference between the 2. There is the species richness of a community. So this left figure on the left is showing species richness, and that basically demonstrates how many species are present in a particular community. The difference then with species diversity, which is shown on the right, species diversity is not just the number of species present, but how abundant is each one. So you notice on the right here, it shows that yes, you have 4 different species, but one of them is far more abundant in this community than the other. So species richness only tells you the number of species in a community. Species diversity will tell you the number and abundance of those species in that community. Now, when we're studying communities, you'll notice, like I keep emphasizing, there are so many different factors that can affect a community, that can affect each population. And so you'll hear a lot of different terminology with communities, because communities are not static, meaning they do, they're not always the same. Communities are constantly changing. A lot of factors are constantly affecting which species are increasing in number, which are decreasing in number. And there are 2 terms to know the difference of when you're looking at community changes. There's bottom-up factors and there's top-down factors. So if we're looking at this figure and we're focusing on algae in this community, bottom-up factors are factors that will affect the primary producer's productivity. Okay, so as you can see in this figure, a reduction in fertilizer produced will limit this algae's nutrient supply. Top-down control, however, refers to consumption factors. Okay, so consumption by, for instance, keystone species that we've mentioned before. So keystone species are the ones that have a significant impact on the community or ecosystem, even though they're not very abundant, right? So top-down factors are basically, things like consumption that then cascade down food chains. So for instance, in this figure, again, we're still focusing on algae. Top-down control would be if, for instance, there is a new big predator in the community. And notice that this big predator then eats this guy, which drops the amount of this guy, but that helps his prey, right? So now that this predator has been taken out and reduced, this one increases, okay? And so with that one increasing, now they're going to be able to eat a lot more algae. So in both of those scenarios, the algae decrease. But one reason the algae decreased was the fertilizer, whereas the other reason was through a cascade throughout the food chain. Okay, so consumption affecting it. Okay, and again, the point here is that the community is not static. You know, the amounts of each species constantly changes, and that affects the other species. Okay, so please note, if you're affecting, you know, the primary producers such as fertilizer, that is bottom-up control. The moment I mention predators, okay, if a new predator is introduced, if an already existing predator is gone, that's all top-down control. So next to top-down control, make sure you mention if you see the word predator changing, that's top-down control. You are now experts at communities, and you are already experts at populations. The last thing for us to talk about is the big picture, the big old ecosystem and biosphere. And just as a reminder, the ecosystem is when you have the communities of different species interacting with the abiotic factors, meaning the non-living factors. So things such as soil and weather, water, air, any of that now is the ecosystem, okay? So as a reminder, organisms are an individual. Then a population is many organisms of the same species. A community is now many populations of different species interacting with each other. But at that level, at the community level, it's still just biotic, just living things. The ecosystem then introduces all of those communities interacting with non-living factors such as water, air, soil, any of that stuff. The other term to remind you of is the big old biosphere, and that is all of the planet that has life, okay? So the part of the planet, this thin layer of the planet where you find all living things, okay? So before you get to the deep old core of molten lava and all that fun stuff, that magma, the biosphere is the thin layer of the planet that has all life. Now, when we talk about ecosystems and the biosphere, one of the big things that we look at is energy flow through these ecosystems. And I have three terms for you to know here, which we've kind of touched upon some of them: the primary producer, the GPP, which is gross primary productivity, and the NPP, which is net primary productivity. And all of these have to do with energy flow through an ecosystem. First, we have the primary producer, which is an autotroph. You know that word already, meaning a primary producer is an organism that can make its own food from inorganic sources, such as carbon dioxide. Okay, and so a lot of times you'll see primary producers as plants or as algae, something that is, photosynthetic. Then you have the GPP, and what that stands for is the total amount of chemical energy produced in an area at a particular time point. Okay, so the total amount of energy produced, and then the NPP. Okay, the NPP is the energy that's invested by primary producers in building their tissues or having offspring. Okay, so basically it's what goes toward what we call biomass, to build new mass. Okay, so you can see in this figure you have a primary producer here. It's a photosynthetic plant. Its GPP is all of the energy produced, whereas the NPP is the portion of that then goes toward building new material. such as new tissues, new cells. When we talk about that energy flow in terms of ecosystems, there's some more terminology that I kind of just want to remind you of. Again, these are things that we've touched upon throughout our various lessons, but I want to make sure that you know that they are key terms, and in future courses, when you come across them, you'll understand what they mean, and that ultimately helps you better understand the various concepts. So when we look at energy flow in ecosystems, one of the terms that you see a lot is consumer. And as we've mentioned before, a consumer is an animal or organism that is consuming, meaning eating another living organism. There are primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. So the primary consumers eat primary producers. The secondary consumers then eat those primary consumers, and the tertiary consumers then eat those secondary consumers. And it goes on in a cycle like that. You also, in these ecosystems, have decomposers, which we also call detritivores. And, since detritivores is such an interesting word, a lot of times that's the term I like to ask about. And any of these will basically obtain their energy in that ecosystem by feeding on dead material. And that can either be dead animals or dead plants. And that's when you look at that, the dead animals and dead plants that they're feeding on, that's actually called detritus, detritus, and that's why they're called detritivores, because they're eating detritus, which is the dead material. Now, when you are looking at all of these different organisms that are eating, that are decomposing various material, and you're looking at the energy that's flowing through them, okay, another term that you'll see is the trophic levels in that ecosystem. When we look at the ecosystem, basically organisms that obtained energy from the various terms that we just talked about, decomposers, primary producers, the secondary, the primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. Those are all different trophic levels, different feeding levels. And ultimately, you can demonstrate those various feeding levels or trophic levels in an ecosystem with the food webs that we've been looking at, or the food chains that we've been looking at. Okay, so these are a lot of terms that you'll see come up again in various other courses as well. Now, in addition to energy, nutrients are also cycling throughout an ecosystem. And so it's important to kind of understand that movement of nutrients throughout the ecosystem, throughout the organisms. Again, a lot of the terminology is repetitive, so you'll notice that when we talk about nutrient cycling, we're again mentioning consumption and decomposition. And look, this term now, circle, star, highlight the term detritus. Remember, detritus is dead material, so dead animal material or dead plant material that can then get ingested by a decomposer. You have the consumers that we keep mentioning. They're either eating plants, they're eating other animals, they're either herbivores or carnivores or omnivores. Those are the consumers. But there's one level in terms of nutrient cycling that we have not mentioned, and that is the term assimilation. And that's simply, whenever you have the absorption of vitamins, minerals, or any other chemicals from food. So for instance, in here you see assimilation where the plants are. That's because they're assimilating, they're absorbing the nutrients from the soil, specifically things like nitrogen. Okay, so important terms to know. Okay, so you're experts with regard to the organisms in these, ecosystems, in the population, in the community, in the ecosystem. You're experts now at the energy flow and the nutrient flow. The last thing I want to touch upon is a little bit more in terms of climate when we look at, ecosystems and specifically global ecology. So I'm sure you've all heard of the idea of the greenhouse effect. So you may have heard the term, but not 100% sure of what it means, okay? And basically what this idea is it's kind of nicely summarized in this figure in the textbooks. And so what this concept is that back in the day, when humans began to emit such massive amounts of carbon dioxide, especially in things like vehicle emissions and all, people basically kind of shrugged it off as like, it's okay because water, for instance, there's so much water around the planet, it should be able to absorb all of this carbon dioxide, won't have a problem, because we mentioned earlier in our lectures the idea of the high specific heat of water and how it can absorb heat and absorb various things. So people thought that they were, safe. But then they started to realize that, basically there was this concept where carbon dioxide is what we call a greenhouse gas. It basically traps heat that's been radiated from Earth, and it basically holds it. So where you see here, the greenhouse gases are basically trapping some of this heat rather than letting it go through, leave the planet. And now this is a problem because what this ends up leading to is the rapid increase in, global temperatures and what we call global warming. Okay, so greenhouse effect is the trapping of heat, within our atmosphere and within our planet based on those greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, and it leads to global warming. When you take later courses, especially if you take courses like biospheres or the environmental science courses, you'll also hear it as a term that I personally love, which is global weirding. So the fact that, you're not seeing just this increase in temperature, this warming of the planet. Instead, you're seeing a lot of weird climate changes. And I'm sure you've even seen that within your own lifespan, how dramatic and how kind of crazy the weather and the climate has been over the past few years compared to maybe when you were younger. Okay, so it's something of concern and something that, more and more research is looking into. Now, why exactly is it of concern? Okay, well, there's a bunch of reasons why global warming or global weirding, any kind of climate change is really scary and really problematic. And I like this table in your textbook because it maps out some of the key consequences of climate change. So please make sure you know that geographic range shifts, phenology shifts, evolutionary adaptation, extinction, and acidification are all consequences of the massive climate change that our planet is experiencing. Okay, and so basically what these different things means is, one, we're seeing major changes in terms of where you find certain plant life or where you find certain species. We're seeing phenology shifts. I want you to circle star, highlight the term phenology. And what that basically means is the timing of seasonal events. Okay, this phenology is when you're looking at the timing of seasonal events. So for instance, if let's say certain organisms only mate in the spring, well, now because of the climate change, it's kind of messing with their internal clocks. So, mating seasons that used to start at a particular, date on the calendar when spring would start are suddenly, let's say, 10, 14 days behind schedule now. They're starting later and later, or in some cases earlier and earlier. So reproductive cycles, or even, eating and hibernation cycles are being affected by the climate change. Evolutionary adaptation, so the idea that various genes are changing and various traits are being favored because the climate is suddenly getting to be at a different point in certain locations. So for instance, if it's warming now in certain locations where it wasn't before, then traits that, survive warmth better will be passed on more frequently. And you'll start to lose allele frequencies of traits that are, let's say, meant for colder climates. There's unfortunately also extinction because, species, some of them are very, very fickle about the temperature, about, the weather, the food sources around them and everything. And as climates change, so too the resources, in that area. And so unfortunately, we're starting to lose various species as well because they're not meant or, for certain environments, and, they just are not adapted to it. And the last one here is acidification. So basically, we mentioned in the previous slide the idea that people expect the water, around the planet to just absorb CO2 for us and, protect us, save us. But that's a problem because, yeah, we live on the land, but there's a whole lot of animals that live in the water. And so absorbing all of those greenhouse gases within the water biomes or the marine biomes, that's problematic because it makes the water more acidic. It changes, the overall survival of organisms there. Okay, so please understand that each of these are potential consequences of what's happening with our climate. And again, Circle Star highlight that term phenology, knowing that it's seasonal events, the timing of seasonal events such as mating seasons. Okay. That is it, not just for today, but for the semester. I want to thank you all. You have all been fantastic. I've really enjoyed the answers and the questions that you've given in the Remind app. And I truly appreciate the work that you have put into this course. I know taking classes online is not the ideal for some students, but I really appreciate the dedication and, the amazing efforts that you put into this course. Okay, if you have any questions, as always, whether it's now, whether it's when you're studying for finals, or even when you are long gone from my class, please never hesitate to contact me day or night. Thank you for an amazing semester, and I not only hope you have a wonderful day, but good luck with finals and have a great end of the semester. Thank you and goodbye.